Thank you for joining us today. This is the virtual edition of the Geneva class of Stevens Valley Church, and the study is that of the prophet Isaiah. If you watched the program last week, we looked at chapters 11 through 15. However, in the class, the personal class last week, we covered only two chapters, and that would be chapters 11 and 12, because the topic there would be the Messiah. These are messianic prophecies, and I felt the need was to spend a little more time with that, which simply means that we didn't cover the last three of those five. So today, in order to keep our recordings essentially the same, so that you're going to see in this recording what is covered in the personal class on campus, so to speak, we're going to begin with chapter 13 and continue up adding 16. And the reason for adding 16 is that both 15 and 16 deal with Moab. That having been said, today you're going to notice God's judgment expressed to the prophet Isaiah on various nations. And we're going to see judgment on Babylon, as well as Assyria, as well as Philistia, as well as Moab. These are all enemies of God's people, particularly, of course, in Judah, the Jewish people. So it's going to be the emphasis on that, the nations. You're going to see that he's going to cover Babylon first, which is interesting because Babylon is not introduced at all, and what we're seeing is the fall of Babylon. And obviously, Assyria is going to fall to Babylon before Babylon is even in the picture, and Babylon eventually will fall to the Medes and Persians. Now, if we're asked for the reason for that, just my conclusion is that he begins with the most powerful, and that's Babylon, and then Assyria, the next most powerful, and then the Philistines, and so forth, down to Moab. That is just an opinion on the reason for putting Babylon here at this point before he even has discussed the beginning of it. Another thing that you'll notice today in the class, as we look at Isaiah and his position in reference to the kings of Judah, and the last time we looked at it, we also put the kings of Israel in there. I removed them today, so just the kings of Judah, because those are the ones that he relates to. And you'll notice that there is a difference in the years that these kings ruled, and that is the difference between Kings and Chronicles. Again, of course, the more skeptical scholars will look at that and say this is evidence the Bible is not inspired. There are many reasons for that. We'll look at that today. Simply, I think the most profound of those reasons is that one followed the lunar calendar and one the solar calendar. And the author or authors of Chronicles are going to tie themselves especially to the house of David, and the authors of the Kings, First and Second Kings, will include the house of Israel as well. So there are discrepancies depending on how you count the beginning and end of these kings, their regnal years, whether they reigned in tandem with others, whether you're going to count their beginning year, and whether there is a regency. And that's the case many times, for instance, with Uzziah and Azariah. So with that in mind, let's look at the program for today, as we'll begin with chapter 13. Isaiah, judgment, redemption, and hope. Chapters 13 to 16. Now, if we take an overview of these chapters, again, it's going to be a wide range of prophetic themes, but primarily judgment on the nations and the unfolding of God's plans for Israel and the surrounding nations. And as always, we're going to see subjects brought in, and then they're going to be expanded on and developed as time goes on. So let's look particularly at 13 now. Now the focus is shifting from the messianic prophecies that we saw in 11 and 12 to God's judgment on Babylon, which becomes a symbol of pride and rebellion against God. Now you'll see introduced here the concept of the day of the Lord, which is never a day to look forward to, because the day of the Lord describes God's vengeance and his punishment of those who have done wrong in his sight. So Isaiah describes the destruction of Babylon long before he described the introduction of Babylon as a part of the day of the Lord, a time of divine reckoning. The imagery is vivid and terrifying, emphasizing the cosmic and comprehensive nature of God's judgment. It is a terrible thing. And so he's bringing down the most powerful of Israel's adversaries. And then we see the fall of Babylon. And of course, God used the Medes and Persians as instruments of judgment, the Medes combining with the Persians and forming this enormous and this very powerful Medo-Persian empire. Media, which was a separate nation, had the population, it had the land amount, it's a very large kingdom, it had the military ability, all of that. However, the Persians had the leadership, the wisdom, they had the tradition long before, and the religious emphasis. So you combine the two, the advantages of the Medes and the advantages of the Persians, to form this Medo-Persian empire, and that is what brought down Babylon, and that is what ruled until they in turn were brought down by the Macedonians. So Babylon's downfall is not just political, but symbolic of the collapse of human arrogance and self-reliance, human pride. So this prophecy also underscores the sovereignty of God over the nations, God's sovereignty and God's disdain for human pride. Now, before we come to look at it in particular, let's just review again the position of these Mesopotamian civilizations. Remember, the first civilization in history is Sumer, maybe somewhere around 3500 BC to 1900 BC. But this is long before the nation of Israel arose, which is going to be somewhere between 1500 and 1200 BC. Sumer was overcome by the Akkadians around 2400, ruling to 2270, and the Akkadians were overcome by the Amorites. And the Amorites established their capital at Babylon, hence they're known as the Babylonians. We'd call this the first Babylonian Empire, 2000 to 1600. Now, for the next 500 years, you're going to see three different Mesopotamian kingdoms, and they're going to rule different areas, and it's going to vary over a period of 500 years. The Kassites, the Haranians, and the Mitanni. But 1600 to 1100, these three are in power, never one completely, but you'll see them at controlling various parts of this Mesopotamian area. And then the Assyrians come in 1300. They're going to eventually take over. They don't really take over Mesopotamia until 1100. They're just forming, and they are subservient at this time to these other powers, but they will become the predominant power in 1300. And by 1100, they will have a powerful dynasty, and a very powerful dynasty by about 900. So around 1300, 1100, and 900, with increments of 200 years as the Assyrians gained power. They're a brutal people who use psychological warfare in every way possible to intimidate their opponents. So the Assyrians are the initial enemies of Israel. They're the first ones with whom Israel will have to do, relate to. But they will be overcome by the new Babylonian Empire of Nebuchadnezzar in 606, the Battle of Carchemish. The Neo-Babylonians will rule till 539. So Isaiah is going to deal with the fall of these Neo-Babylonians first, to show God's sovereignty and his disapproval of pride and arrogance. And then the Persian Empire, which God raised up. Cyrus was the first, and then, of course, Darius, 550 to 331. Now, the Neo-Babylonian Empire was created by Nabopolassar, and then his son Nebuchadnezzar II is the great king. And he will defeat Assyria in 606 at the Battle of Carchemish, conquer the entire area, and will take Jews in captivity for on three occasions, 604, 597, and 586 BC. He will destroy Jerusalem and the temple. In 586, he will do that which Assyria tried to do and failed to do. The empire then will fall to the Persians in 539. Now, here's the table of the kings. I removed the kings of Israel because Isaiah dealt with the kings of Judah. So he starts with Uzziah and the time of Uzziah's death, the year of his death, which will pinpoint him at 740 or 739 BC. He will then he will then prophesy during the reign of Jotham, which will be 750 to 735 or 730. Again, you see these differences in the regnal years, and I've mentioned that in the introduction. There are several reasons for that. And then during this time, the time of Azariah, for instance, Uzziah is alive but inactive because he was struck with leprosy by God for having presumed to offer incense, which he did not have the right to do, not being a priest. And then Ahaz, considerable amount of activity and prophecy with Isaiah during the time of Ahaz. And that is 735 or 730 to 715. And then comes Hezekiah, very righteous king. We'll see quite a bit in the last part of Isaiah's prophecy about Hezekiah. It is thought that perhaps Manasseh was reigning at the time of Isaiah's death. It is thought that maybe Manasseh is the one mentioned in the book of Hebrews as having sawn Isaiah in two. We don't know for sure about that. So let's come to an introduction and development of the 13th chapter and the fall of Babylon. The oracle concerning Babylon, which Isaiah, the son of Amos, saw on a bare hill, raise a signal, cry aloud to them, wave the hand for them to enter the gates of the nobles. I myself have commanded my consecrated ones and have summoned my mighty men to execute my anger, my proudly exulting ones. The sound of a tumult is on the mountains, as of a great multitude, the sound of an uproar of kingdoms, of nations gathering together. The Lord of hosts is mustering a host for battle. They come from a distant land, from the end of the heavens. The Lord and his weapons of his indignation to destroy the whole land. Now, this is a poetic description of the fall of Babylon to the Medes and the Persians, which occurred in 539. Wail, for the day of the Lord is near. As destruction from the Almighty, it will come. Therefore, all hands will be feeble, and every human heart will melt. They will be dismayed. Pains and agony will seize them. They'll be in anguish like a woman in labor. They will look aghast at one another. Their faces will be aflame. Behold, the day of the Lord comes, cruel with wrath and fierce anger, to make the land a desolation and to destroy its sinners from it. For the stars of the heavens and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be dark at its rising, and the moon will not shed its light. Now, I'll just comment on these passages, which verse 6 down to verse 10, that we have this concept of the day of the Lord. And you will see from what was just read, it is not a day that is very pleasant. It is a day of destruction of God's enemies, a day, as he says, of wailing. As destruction from the Almighty, it will come. And then further describing the punishment of the wicked, at verse 11, I will punish the world for its evil and the wicked for their iniquity. I will put an end to the pomp of the arrogant and lay low the pompous pride of the ruthless. I will make people more rare than fine gold, and mankind than the gold of Ophir. Therefore, I will make the heavens tremble, and the earth will be shaken out of its place, as the wrath of the Lord of hosts in the day of his fierce anger. And like a hunted gazelle, or like sheep with none to gather them, each will turn to his own people, and each will flee to his own land. Whoever is found will be thrust through, and whoever is caught will fall by the sword. Their infants will be dashed in pieces before their eyes. Their houses will be plundered, and their wives ravished. And then further information on the fall of Babylon by means of God raising up the Medes and Persians. Therefore, behold, I am stirring up the Medes against them, who have no regard for silver, and do not delight in gold. Their bows will slaughter the young men. They will have no mercy on the fruit of the womb. Their eyes will not pity children. And Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, the splendor and pomp of the Chaldeans, will be like Sodom and Gomorrah when God overthrew them. It will never be inhabited or lived in for all generations. No Arab will pitch his tent there. No shepherds will make their flocks lie down there, but wild animals will lie down there, and their houses will be full of howling creatures. There ostriches will dwell, and there wild goats will dance. Hyenas will cry in its towers, and jackals in the pleasant palaces. Its time is close at hand, and its days will not be prolonged. Before we leave this section of verses 17 to 22, it will be noted that Arabs have refused ever to spend the night on the site of ancient Babylon. They feel like it's haunted. And even though it is deserted and there are going to be wild animals inhabiting these places, these pleasant palaces, the city itself at this point was not destroyed. It was forsaken, it was desolate. No people were living there except these animals for a while, but later on we find Jewish people living in Babylon, and that becomes a center of Jewish civilization after the fall of Jerusalem. Eventually, the city itself was completely demolished, but the ruins were still there, but they have never been rebuilt as God willed. As we move into chapter 14, we're going to see this theme of the destruction of Babylon continuing and the restoration of Israel. And I will just note that we're going to see a reference to Israel in terms of the 10 northern tribes that were taken into captivity by the Assyrians in 722, returning. And we might say returning to what? Because Israel was destroyed. That northern kingdom was destroyed and was never rebuilt. There will be some returning, but they will return to Judah, evidently. So we'll see these themes as we look at chapter 14. First, Israel's future restoration, verses 1 and 2. It begins with a promise of mercy for Israel. The reversal of fortunes is striking. Those who once oppressed Israel will become their servants. And secondly, we will see continued this taunt against the king of Babylon, particularly the king. So Isaiah includes a poetic taunt directed at the king of Babylon, mocking his fall from glory. The imagery of the morning star, which is translated Lucifer in the Latin Vulgate, has been interpreted by many as both a reference to the prideful Babylonian king and a typological foreshadowing of Satan's rebellion and fall. In other words, this prophecy is a typological prophecy that has an immediate fulfillment with the Babylonian king and an ultimate fulfillment in the downfall of the devil's reign. And thirdly, judgment on Assyria and Philistia. And it's interesting now he turns to the earlier empire of Assyria, and as I suggested earlier, it is perhaps because Assyria was ultimately less powerful than Babylon. He starts with the most powerful, and then the Philistines would be really less powerful than Assyria. So the chapter ends with assurances that God's purposes will stand. There's God's sovereignty, including the destruction of Assyria and Philistia. This highlights God's control over history and his commitment to defend his people. And you'll notice that the chapter begins with prose, with information, continuing into verse 3 and 4. For the Lord will have compassion on Jacob and will again choose Israel and will set them in their own land. And sojourners will join them and will attach themselves to the house of Jacob. And the peoples will take them and bring them to their place, and the house of Israel will possess them in the Lord's land as male and female slaves. They will take captive those who were their captors and rule over those who oppress them. When the Lord has given you rest from your pain and turmoil and the hard service with which you were made to serve, you will take up this taunt against the king of Babylon. How the oppressor has ceased, the insolent fury ceased. The Lord has broken the staff of the wicked, the scepter of rulers, that struck the peoples in wrath with unceasing blows, that rule the kingdoms in anger with unrelenting persecution. The whole earth is at rest and quiet. They break forth into singing. The cypresses rejoice at you, the cedars of Lebanon, saying, since you were laid low, no woodcutter comes up against us. Sheol beneath is stirred up to meet you when you come. It rouses the shades to greet you. All who were leaders of the earth, it raises from their thrones. All who were kings of the nations, all of them will answer and say to you, you too have become as weak as we. You have become like us. Your pomp is brought down to Sheol, the sound of your harps. Maggots are laid as a bed beneath you, and worms are your covers. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. But you are brought down to Sheol, to the far reaches of the pit. Those who see you will stare at you and ponder over you. Is this the man who made the earth tremble, who shook kingdoms, who made the world like a desert and overthrew its cities, who will not let his prisoners go home? Now, if we just stop to comment, this is obviously talking about the king, about his pride and how powerful he once was, and now says Isaiah in prophecy, he's brought down to Sheol in the far reaches of the pit. I'll mention while we're looking at this that earlier he had said that the cypresses are able to grow without any danger of being cut down because there are no people to cut them down and to build anything. The land is so desolate. So we'll continue to look at it. And now in this section, we'll see at the end of verse 22 to 23, the broom of destruction. God is going to sweep the Babylon in particular with his broom of destruction and to clean it up, so to speak. So we continue in verse 18. All the kings of the nations lie in glory, each in his own tomb, but you are cast out away from your grave like a loathed branch, clothed with the slain, those pierced by the sword, who go down to the stones of the pit, like a dead body trampled underfoot. You will not be joined with them in burial, because you have destroyed your land. You have slain your people. May the offspring of evildoers nevermore be named. Prepare slaughter for his sons because of the guilt of their fathers, lest they rise and possess the earth and fill the face of the world with cities. In other words, it's not going to happen again. And so Isaiah continues, this time in prose. I will rise up against them, declares the Lord of hosts, and will cut off from Babylon name and remnant, descendants and posterity, declares the Lord. And I will make it a possession of the hedgehog and pools of water, and I will sweep it with the broom of destruction, declares the Lord of hosts. Again, we're seeing this reference to the depopulation of Babylon and to its being inhabited by animals. In this section, God's sovereignty is emphasized, his purpose that will stand. So please note that as we go through now verses 24 down to 27. The Lord of hosts has sworn, as I have planned, so shall it be. And as I have purposed, so shall it stand, that I will break the Assyrian in my land, and on my mountains trample him underfoot. And his yoke shall depart from them, and his burden from their shoulder. This is the purpose that is purposed concerning the whole earth. And this is the hand that is stretched out over the nations. For the Lord of hosts has purposed, and who will annul it? His hand is stretched out, and who will turn it back? So please notice that the subject no longer is Babylon. He is now moving to Assyria. And as I suggested, perhaps because Assyria, though powerful, was not as powerful as Babylon. The point, whether we're talking of Babylon or Assyria or Philistia or any of them, is that God's purpose will be accomplished, and no one can stop the purpose of God from being executed. And now at this point, he turns to the Philistines, which they had harassed Israel for many, many years and been the traditional enemies, particularly during the time of David. So obviously, Isaiah is going to be concerned about their fate and the justice of God as applied to them. This oracle begins in the year that King Ahaz died, and that would be 715 BC. Rejoice not, O Philistia, all of you, that the rod that struck you is broken. For from the serpent's root it will come forth an adder, and its fruit will be flying a fiery serpent, and the firstborn of the poor will graze, and the needy lie down in safety. But I will kill your root with famine, and your remnant it will slay. Wail, O gate, cry out, O city, melt in fear, O Philistia, all of you, for smoke comes out of the north, and there is no straggler in its ranks. What will one answer the messengers of the nation? The Lord has founded Zion, and in her the afflicted of his people find refuge. Obviously, he's telling the Philistines, don't rejoice because the rod that struck you, and I think the last reference was to Assyria. We also could be Babylon, but I think Assyria. And don't be happy about that, because God is going to inflict his justice on you for your sins, and looks back to Zion. You have harassed and tormented the Jews for centuries, but the Lord has founded Zion, that's the citadel of Jerusalem, the stronghold, and in her the afflicted of his people will find refuge. And out of the north is going to come the enemy, your enemy, that's going to subjugate you, which would probably be a reference if Assyria is the first reference to Babylon, but it could be, of course, the Medes and Persians. He doesn't specify. The point is, Philistia is going to be punished. Now, in chapter 15 into chapter 16, he turns his attention to Moab. Again, if we're going to consider most powerful to least powerful or lesser powerful, Moab's down the line. But Moab had been a continual enemy of Israel. Moab and Ammon being descendants of Lot, the nephew of Abraham. And so this chapter begins a two-chapter oracle against Moab, a neighboring nation. Isaiah describes the devastation of Moab's cities and the grief of its people. And you'll see these cities mentioned. We're not familiar with any of them, but I will say as you see them, they are cities in the Moabite territory. The tone is both sorrowful and solemn, reflecting God's justice, tempered with compassion. The imagery of weeping and lamentation underscores the extent of Moab's suffering. And Moab's pride, and God always resists the proud, Moab's pride and reliance on false gods, which are mentioned in chapter 16, are the key reasons for their downfall: pride and idolatry. So in chapter 15, an oracle concerning Moab, because Ar of Moab is laid waste in a night, Moab is undone. Because Kir of Moab is laid waste in a night, Moab is undone. He has gone up to the temple and to Dibon, to the high places to weep over Nebo and over Medeba. Moab wails. On every head is baldness, every beard is shorn. In the streets they wear sackcloth. On the housetops and in the squares, everyone wails and melts in tears. Heshbon and Elealeh cry out. Their voice is heard as far as Jehaz. Therefore the armed men of Moab cry out. His soul trembles. My heart cries out for Moab. Her fugitives flee to Zoar, to Eglath Shalishiah. For at the ascent of Luhith they go up weeping. On the road to Horonaim they raise a cry of destruction. The waters of Nimrib are a desolation. The grass is withered, the vegetation fails, the greenery is no more. Therefore, the abundance they have gained and what they have laid up, they carry away over the brook of the willows. For a cry has gone around the land of Moab. Her wailing reaches to Eglaim. Her wailing reaches to Beer Elam. For the waters of Dibon are full of blood. And I will bring upon Dibon even more. A lion for those of Moab who escape, for the remnant of the land. Matthew Henry has this comment on this chapter we have just looked at, chapter 15. In the close of the chapter we have, and I think these points are important, the insufficiency of the gods of Moab, the false gods, to help them. Moab shall soon weary of the high place. He shall spend his spirits and strength in vain, and praying to his idols. They cannot help him. He shall be convinced that they cannot. And secondly, we have insufficiency of the gods of Moab and the sufficiency of the God of Israel, the only true God, to make good what he has spoken against them. And Isaiah is going to point out the thing itself was long since determined. Now it was made known what it should be done, when it should be done. The time was before fixed in the counsel of God, but now it was revealed. The Lord has spoken that it shall be within 3 years. So this is what we'll look forward to in chapter 16. It continues the prophecy against Moab that's introduced in chapter 15. It's a poignant lament for Moab's impending destruction. Now, one might say, why is there this concern? Did God have this concern and give them some degree of hope? And that's the fact that there were some Moabites who were very faithful to God and were involved in Israel's history. For instance, Ruth, a Moabitess. And so he does hold out some blessings for them in the face of this punishment. So it is a poignant lament for Moab's impending destruction. The chapter begins with an appeal to Moab to send tribute to Zion as a sign of humility and alliance. Particularly, you'll notice lambs. The imagery of fleeing birds and scattered nests illustrates Moab's vulnerability and disarray. Now, verses 3 to 5, the focus will shift to a plea for justice and mercy that's likely directed at Judah as Moab seeks refuge. The plea anticipates a future in which a righteous ruler from David's line will establish justice, a messianic hope. However, Moab's pride is highlighted as its downfall, and the remainder of the chapter laments its fate, emphasizing the devastation of its agricultural wealth, particularly its vineyards. And the chapter concludes with a prophetic timeline. Within 3 years, Moab's glory will be diminished. The message underscores the consequences of pride and the importance of humility before God. All of these great themes we'll see in chapter 16, still in reference to Moab. And before we turn to it, let's just bring in Matthew Henry's comment on chapter 16. This chapter continues and concludes the burden of Moab in it, and he'll have the same basic points that we saw in the other presentation. The prophet gives good counsel to the Moabites to reform what was amiss among them, and particularly to be kind to God's people as the likeliest way to prevent the judgments before threatened. That's verses 1 to 5. And then, second point, fearing they would not take this counsel because they were so proud, He goes on to foretell the lamentable devastation of their country and the confusion they should be brought to, and this within 3 years, verses 6 to 14. You'll see at the beginning the lamb. There's the story behind this, which is not fully discussed by Isaiah. Tribute had been sent, and that was a part of the treaty with Moab. Moab would send tribute to the kings of Judah in the form of lambs. They were formerly sent to Israel. Israel by this time is gone. The point is, resume sending tribute in the form of a lamb. So send the lamb to the ruler of the land from Selah by way of the desert, to the mount of the daughter of Zion. Like fleeing birds, like a scattered nest, so are the daughters of Moab at the fords of the Arnon. Give counsel, grant justice, make your shade like night at the height of the noon. Shelter the outcasts, do not reveal the fugitive. Let the outcasts of Moab sojourn among you, be a shelter to them from the destroyer when the oppressor is no more and destruction has ceased. This is an interesting advice, and it seems to be directed to Judah, that as Moab is punished and as people leave Moab and they're outcasts and they're refugees, give shelter to them, look after them, take them in, show mercy to these who have been exiled, these strangers among you. And he who tramples underfoot has vanished from the land. Then a throne will be established in steadfast love, and on it will sit in faithfulness in the tent of David, the one who judges and seeks justice and is swift to do righteousness. We have heard of the pride of Moab, how proud he is, of his arrogance, his pride, and his insolence. In his idle boasting, he is not right. Therefore, let Moab wail for Moab. Let everyone wail, mourn, utterly stricken for the raisin cakes of Kir Hareseth. For the fields of Heshbon languish, and the vine of Sibmah. The lords of the nations have struck down its branches, which reached to Jazer, and strayed to the desert. Its shoots spread abroad and passed over the sea. Therefore, I weep with the weeping of Jazer, for the vine of Sibmah. I drench you with my tears, O Heshbon Elealeh, and over your summer fruit and your harvest, the shout has ceased. And joy and gladness are taken from the fruitful field. And in the vineyards, no songs are sung, no cheers are raised, no treader treads out the wine in the presses. I have put an end to the shouting. Therefore, my inner parts mourn with like a lyre for Moab, and my inmost self for Kir Hareseth. And when Moab presents himself, when he wearies himself on the high place, when he comes to his sanctuary to pray, he will not prevail. This is the word that the Lord spoke concerning Moab in the past. But now the Lord has spoken, saying, in 3 years, like the years of a hired worker, the glory of Moab will be brought into contempt, in spite of all his great multitude, and those who remain will be very few and feeble. As we look back over these chapters, obviously one thing that stands out would be God's sovereignty, emphasized by Isaiah. The judgment oracles, chapters 13 to 16, emphasize God's authority over all nations, reminding readers that no power is beyond his control. That's the first major theme. Secondly, the theme of restoration and redemption. Even in the midst of judgment, Isaiah highlights God's plan to restore his people and to extend his salvation to the nations. And then we'll see warnings against pride. The downfall of Moab and Babylon serves as a warning against arrogance and self-reliance, themes that remain relevant in every generation. Now, by connecting hope with judgment, which of course is the case, there's judgment, there's always hope, Isaiah 13 to 16 encourages trust in God's justice and his ultimate plan to bring about a renewed creation under the reign of the Messiah. And so next week, we'll plan to look at chapters 17 to 20. That'll be our next study. Again, thank you for your interest. Thank you for being a part of our virtual class today. And certainly pray that the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God, our Father, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit will be with you now and forever.